Julianne Ginter.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koutou te whare. I rise to speak on the second reading of the Corrections Amendment Bill. The Green Party opposed this bill at first reading based on our objections to provisions within it which, in our view, diminish basic human rights of prisoners, that potentially make our prisons less safe and less likely to achieve the essential goal of rehabilitation and making our public sector, making New Zealand safer. And as the Honourable Phil Goff just said, further entrench the privatization of prisons, which is really a core, fundamental role of the state. Now, I did not have the privilege of following this bill through Select Committee. That was my eminently capable colleague, David Clendon. And as I understand it, the bill that has come back from Select Committee does have some minor improvements. It's not quite as bad as the one that did go to Select Committee. And that is largely due to the excellent submissions from the Law Society, from the Human Rights Commission, from the Howard League, and from Rethinking Crime and Punishment. And really it's down to, the excellent work of the Green and Labour members of the Select Committee to talk to some common sense into to ensure that common sense was actually implemented in the bill. But we cannot support the bill as it is, even though it has been improved. And there are three basic reasons for that. The first is human rights, and it does continue the government erosion of human rights of prisoners. The Human Rights Commission gave an excellent submission which pointed out that the cumulative impact of some of these changes is to fundamentally erode human rights. And I'd like to just read from the submission because I think it really is excellent. The Commission considers that respect for human dignity, as well as being a fundamental and universal human rights obligation, is also linked to reintegration and rehabilitation. And a good deal of research that was undertaken for the Commission into human rights in New Zealand prisons found that human rights values have a key role in the rehabilitation of prisoners. There's a report called Human Rights in Prisons, and it notes the international literature also shows that the attention to human rights in prisons helps reduce conflict, it strengthens prisoners' chances of rehabilitation, and ultimately leads to safer societies. So not only are human rights something that we need to guarantee to all members of society, even those who've been imprisoned, it's actually the best way to get the outcome that we all want, which is a safer society. And I was really surprised to hear the member Jackie Dean in her speech earlier this evening argue that this increased strip searching that is going to really dig right into the most private places of a person is somehow going to help prisoners who have mental health difficulties and who might be at risk of self-harm. Because it would be obvious to me, I would think to anyone, but is also confirmed by overseas research, that the psychological impacts of strip searching on prisoners have a significantly negative impact, and particularly on the female prison population. There's been a good deal of research from around the world which questions the effectiveness of strip searching, both as a contraband control and as a security strategy. International research has also shown that the number of female prisoners who have suffered violent and in particular sexual abuse is very high. So there is considerable risk for the abuse of strip searches. There is really no evidence to support the idea that it's going to be effective at minimizing the likelihood of prisoners inflicting any sort of self-harm. If anything, the psychological impacts are going to be negative and make them more likely to suffer from negative psychological consequences. So it really undermines the whole purported goal of safety in prisons, and that also it limits the ability of prisons to be effective in rehabilitating prisoners, which really is the purpose, supposedly the stated purpose of the bill. And so again, we see this conflict, which is quite common in the legislation coming forward from this government, in that it has certain stated goals, like increasing the safety of New Zealanders or increasing the economic productivity of New Zealand. But in fact, the tools that they're using to achieve these goals will actually do the direct opposite of what they're intended to do. And so a second concern is the ability of prisoners to get adequate exercise. And it should also be obvious that fundamental to good psychological well-being of prisoners is regular exercise. That's true for all humans. And although there was a minor improvement to the bill in the Select Committee in that instead of getting rid of any requirement for exercise, it now limits it to 2 days without exercise. But we're talking about people being held in very close quarters, potentially in very small rooms or in the back of a prison van for up to 48 hours without having the opportunity to exercise, simply to achieve a goal of cost cutting, which really is not a good enough reason to stop looking after the health of prisoners and their fundamental right to get out and move around and get some fresh air, which is going to be better for them, better for all of us in the long run. And on the topic of health, the fact is that, and this, I'm going to read from this excellent submission from Rethinking Crime and Punishment, that the state of prisoner health in New Zealand is very poor, particularly in oral health, mental health, alcohol and other drug-related ailments, chronic disease, communicable disease, and disabilities. It is much worse than the general population of New Zealand. And there is a good deal of evidence that the prison environment has a negative effect on the health of prisoners. And there have been a number of reports, notably one from the Ombudsman, which I believe another member mentioned earlier, which have called on the primary health care to be provided by the Ministry of Health as opposed to the Department of Corrections. So the report of the Office of the Ombudsman states, "We strongly urge that the Department of Corrections Health Service be aligned with the wider health system. Health services for prisoners should be funded and delivered by an agency whose primary focus is health and therapeutic support, not custodial services," which is what fundamentally the Department of Correction is responsible for. And similarly, the National Health Committee has stated that there are a number of unresolved concerns for prisoner health because there's a fundamental conflict between the custodial role of the Department of Corrections and its role and the role that health services must play in providing a high-quality service. So it's unfortunate that we don't see the recommendations of these reports being implemented in this legislation. And what's worse, there's actually a provision, I believe it's in Clause 8, subsection 20, which is going to move the responsibility for prisoner health care from the medical officer to the health center manager. And it's changing the principal legislation so that there's no longer a requirement for a minimum number of medical officers. The language has been changed to just a sufficient number, but ultimately we're extremely concerned that this is actually just a cost-cutting approach to prisoner health. And history indicates that the short-term cost cuts in healthcare in prisons or anywhere else inevitably lead to longer-term social and economic costs in the future. So the reductionist approach of this government to justice, to health, and to many other areas is actually going to cost us more in the long term and fundamentally not achieve a safer New Zealand or the principles of justice. And finally, I was quite amused to hear the member Jackie Dean say that the Labour Party was ideologically opposed to the private sector involvement in corrections, because I would take it to be a fundamental principle of democracy that the state has a monopoly on the ability to use coercive force, and it should not be the private sector, because simply a profit motive is not going to deliver justice. If anything, it's going to deliver extremely perverse outcomes, as we have seen in the United States, where a private detention center for juveniles was paying off judges to send young people to a juvenile detention center. And that is exactly the sort of outcome that you get when you have the private profit motive conflated with what is fundamentally a core public role, which is the serving justice and enforcing the rule of the law of the land. So we are extremely concerned. We won't be supporting this bill for those reasons, because it erodes human rights. It is not going to do much for the health of prisoners, and it's going to entrench private prisons, which is going to be bad for New Zealand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mark Mitchell.
Speaker. It's a